Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, energy facilities in the Middle East under attack, including the world's largest LNG hub in Qatar. Gas prices have soared, our global markets facing a tipping point. As Qatar's gas is disrupted, Europe and Asia are battling for alternative supplies. Who can fill the gap? And are American companies among the biggest winners? Asian nations are among the hardest hit. The energy shock could send their economies into crisis. Can governments shield businesses and households? And at what cost? This will bring down the economies of the world. That was the warning from Qatar's energy minister at the start of the Iran conflict, and he may not have been exaggerating. Energy supplies were already disrupted, but now, in a sharp escalation, energy production itself is in the firing line. Iran targeted facilities across the Gulf, including the world's largest liquefied natural gas hub in Qatar. It was retaliation for an Israeli strike on an Iranian gas field hours earlier. Energy prices have soared. Countries from Asia to Europe are scrambling for alternative supplies. But for Asia, this is a severe energy shock. The region depends on Gulf supplies to keep its lights on, its factories running, and its people fed. Governments across the region have moved quickly to limit the damage. But will it be enough? Fintan Monaghan reports.
As the US and Israel wage war with Iran, the world's natural gas supply is being caught in the crossfire. This Israeli strike on Iran's South Pars gas field paralyzed production for several days. Iran responded with strikes of its own on Qatar's Ras Laffan gas site and other energy sites across the Gulf. Iran has already effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, blocking most energy exports by sea. But attacks on energy infrastructure raises the danger of more lasting disruption. Qatar and Iran share control of the world's largest gas field. The Iranian section is South Pars. The Qatari section is called the North Field. For Iran, disruptions are a domestic problem. It uses most of its LNG at home. But Qatar is one of the world's largest exporters, providing 20% of global supply. Since the crisis broke out, the benchmark price for LNG had at one point more than doubled in Europe and Asia. EU leaders realized the danger. The region imports virtually all its LNG. With supply now reduced, Europe and Asia are now competing for what's left, driving up the price even further. And long-term problems with supply would have even more serious consequences.
Parce que tout cela, évidemment, a un impact.
It has an impact on the global market. We've known this since the start of this war. Gas and oil prices have risen, but if the production facilities themselves are destroyed, this war will have a much more lasting impact.
But in the east, the situation is more dire. 80% of LNG that passes through the Strait of Hormuz ends up in Asia. Many economies in the region chose to rely on natural gas to power their growth. It's less polluting than coal and more reliable than renewables. But this all rested on the assumption of a stable supply, a notion that's now being challenged. Some richer countries like China, Korea, and Japan have deep reserves to weather any immediate impact. Others aren't so well positioned and are already taking action to conserve energy. The Philippines has switched to a 4-day work week and ordered government officials to cut power usage. And in Thailand, air conditioning is being cut in offices. Light clothing is the new rule, with even news anchors taking off their jackets. But some shifts are taking place which might have longer-term consequences. Taiwan's economy ministry plans to buy more LNG from the United States, one of the other major global suppliers. The US has been ramping up production and could be well placed to capture market share. Many countries like Bangladesh and Thailand are firing up coal plants to full capacity, as LNG proves more expensive and harder to come by. And others have already been investing in renewables. Pakistan tripled its solar capacity in the past 5 years, and hopes to become more self-reliant in the future.
We are planning to go up to about 90%, over 90% in the next 6 to 8 years. Many new hydro run-of-the-river and other projects are coming online.
Right now, the Iran war is causing chaos in the global economy. But when the dust settles, it may also have a long-term impact on the flow of energy around the world. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Let's bring in our panel of experts. Colby Connolly is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and the head of Middle East content at Energy Intelligence. He joins us from Dubai. Louise Liu is the head of Asia Economics at Oxford Economics, and she joins us from Singapore. And Ed Hers is an energy economist and lecturer at the University of Houston. Thanks all for joining us. Let's start in Dubai then. The attacks by Iran on the Gulf's energy infrastructure, particularly Ras Laffan. How important is Ras Laffan? Just remind us. And with that plant being damaged, how significant an impact is that going to have on global energy supply?
Yeah, well, Ras Laffan is a major portion of global LNG production. It holds around 77 million tons a year in capacity, and it is growing. It's worth pointing out by 2030, the world had expected that volume would roughly double. And it's also worth mentioning that it's the largest single site for LNG production worldwide. There is no alternate way to get those volumes out of the Gulf. And as a result, you've seen significant price increases in both Asian and European gas markets, where there aren't really large domestic resource bases for natural gas production. So most countries that do rely more heavily on gas are net importers, and LNG is a critical component of that. Now, if we're looking at the global picture, Ras Laffan is one piece of that. It's a very important piece, but we're at the very early stages of a global wave of new LNG that was expected to post significant growth in the next couple of years, and it's something that would, based on fundamentals, exert downward pressure on prices around the world, which would be very helpful for what you'd think of as a lot of price-sensitive markets, particularly in emerging and developing economies. Depending on how long the volumes from Ras Laffan are inaccessible and how long it may take to repair the damage that's been done to the facility, new capacity that comes online will not be adding to global capacity. It will be, at least for hopefully a short period of time, offsetting losses. So I believe the total volume of production that was damaged at Ras Laffan was around 14 million tons in capacity, 14 million tons a year. And so, it's not as though these massive additions, that are planned for Ras Laffan are materializing in the same way everywhere else. It's typically smaller scale. So this will cause quite a bit of volatility in gas markets, certainly for the foreseeable future.
Louise, as the biggest buyer of LNG, how exposed to the shock are the economies of Asia?
Well, very exposed. Like what Colby is saying, a lot of the economies in Asia really depend on these seaborne natural gas that's coming from the Middle East, right? So you're thinking about economies like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, that really depends, I would say, almost 100% of their natural gas comes from as LNG, and around a third of them comes from the Middle East. So there is a significant vulnerability here. And I think with the energy crunch, with the crisis evolving, even economies in South Asia, so we're talking about the emerging economies, maybe economies that may not be as wealthy, they are also quite exposed, right? So unlike Japan or Korea, which have, some of these long-term contracts with the Middle Eastern sellers, these less wealthy nations actually rely more on the spot markets, which obviously, because of the volatility in pricing, they've really stood to lose out because they're just not able to afford these high-priced Asian spot LNG in the markets. So the vulnerability is high. The exposure is definitely something to watch out for.
Ed, the US and Israel attacking Iran's energy facilities is meant to put pressure on Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to stop Iran attacking the Gulf's energy infrastructure. That clearly has not deterred Iran. It's still doing so, still keeping the strait closed, still attacking the Gulf's energy facilities. To what extent has President Trump shot himself in the foot here?
Oh my gracious, that's a loaded question. And so it's hard to say. What's interesting is has been pointed out by many people, the asymmetric features of this war and this conflict. President Trump so far has elected not to stop Iran's transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And so Iran's oil has been getting to market. In fact, the president relieved the sanctions on 140 million barrels of Iranian oil that was at sea. It's a very different situation. It's clear that the administration is looking at the midterm elections on the one hand, and then the goals, stated objectives for the war in Iran on the other. And can't fight a war halfway, no matter how it started or what the justifications. And so this pause in attacking Iranian energy infrastructure is meant to preserve their ability to produce and distribute hydrocarbons to the world market after the conflict. But we're not there yet.
Colby, if President Trump follows through on his threat to target Iran's energy facilities, electricity in particular, the deadline due to expire at the end of the week, and then Iran retaliates against the Gulf's energy infrastructure, how much worse could things get?
Well, things can certainly get a lot worse than they are now. As things currently stand, there have been a lot of shut-ins of oil and gas production. Most of that is not due to attacks on energy infrastructure. It's mostly as a result of the fact that shipping cannot move through the strait at a normal volume that it would in peacetime. Now, if Iran does retaliate against oil and gas infrastructure in the region and is able to significantly damage it further, then it will take that much longer to repair that infrastructure and restart production whenever hostilities either begin to wind down or cease altogether. So there's certainly a lot of scope for the supply disruption and its scale to worsen if things escalate along these lines.
Louise, the disruption to supplies has sent prices soaring, particularly gas. How are Asian consumers dealing with that? Has it begun to trickle down to them yet? And to what extent are governments in Asia able to shield consumers in the region, households and businesses?
Well, I would say that, there are a few channels by which consumers are really feeling this squeeze, right? So very immediately, and we've already seen this on the ground in the data, we are seeing higher pump prices, we are seeing higher utility bills just from this past 2 weeks alone. And then there is obviously the indirect cost of, increased transportation, increased manufacturing costs that will slowly be baked into the price of final goods. So that what we call it a cost push inflation, that will continue to weigh on consumer spending, on consumer sentiment as well. And, the bad news really is that the region as a whole haven't really recovered fully, from the 2022 energy crunch that we saw, right? So back then, a lot of the Asian governments actually stepped in to subsidize prices for consumers, for households in the region. And that has led to sovereign balance sheets, that has led to state utility balance sheets being quite stretched. And we haven't really fully recovered from that subsidy burden of 2022. So going into this crisis, I would say that the ability to, really shield the consumers is much smaller. And we've seen that, for instance, in China, in Thailand, really increased willingness to pass that cost on to consumers. And I think that, is really why we think that the inflationary impact this time around is going to be much higher for the region compared to 2022.
Ed, the curious thing here is that the US is the world's biggest LNG supplier. To what extent can it step in and fill the gap here?
Well, all of the LNG export facilities are working at maximum throughput. And at the end of 25, that was roughly 15 billion cubic feet a day. The expectation is that this will double by 2030. There are, I think, 3 trains scheduled to come online in 2026. And so So the market is responding, but it won't be responding in response to the interruption in Qatar's supply. This is just the growth. The LNG market is a little different than most. It's actually one where the prospect of supply actually does create its own demand. No one builds power plants or industrial facilities counting on LNG unless there is a ready supply. So the supply has to start first, and then consumers will build plants to accept it and process it and use it for electricity and manufacturing.
So, Ed, American companies are not necessarily benefiting from this. Is anyone benefiting from this crisis? What about Russia? Could it step in and fill the gap?
Well, Russia has had sanctions on its oil, also relieved by President Trump. Certainly, Russia is well positioned, and to be fair, we all knew that oil was getting to market. It was just getting to market at a discount. We've seen the benefit for downstream processors, a huge jump in the price of diesel across the globe. That's had an impact all the way through the U.S. Simply because now the motorist in Tokyo is competing with the motorist in Singapore and the motorist in Houston. Diesel is extremely important for the Northern Hemisphere's agricultural cycle. We're going into that. The breakdown in the urea supply, nitrogen, has trebled the cost of fertilizers in the United States. Aluminum's been disrupted. It's not just oil and LNG that's causing a huge problem for consumers, and will continue to, as Colby has pointed out. The damage to the production facilities is what we're worried about. Rebuilding an LNG facility can take almost as long, maybe even longer than building it new, because you have to find out what the heck was broken and blown up.
Colby, do you agree that? Why can't you have to explain why these facilities are so complicated here? I mean, we've all seen pictures of them. It's a mass of pipes. Why can't they just be patched up and rerouted?
Yeah, well, the process of liquefaction, which is turning natural gas, which, as its name suggests, is a gas, into a liquid, requires the gas itself to be cooled to extremely cold temperatures. It's an extensive and expensive process. It requires a lot of heavy equipment. It's not something like oil, which, I mean, this is an oversimplification, but oil is a liquid, it's treated and essentially poured into a ship. LNG is not so simple. It needs, again, that cooling process that I mentioned, and it needs to be regasified once it's delivered to its end user, or to the point where it's offloaded from a ship. It's a much more complicated game than transporting oil and refined products, and as a result, the costs and the time that are required to build that infrastructure are commensurate with how complicated the process is.
Louise, we haven't talked about China yet. To what extent is it insulated from the worst of a global energy shock?
Well, it is actually, I mean, there are no winners in a war, but I would say China is relatively much more insulated than some of its neighbors, really for three reasons, right? One is the fact that, over the past few years, we've seen significant stockpiling of critical energy supplies, because Beijing is very much focused on energy security over the last few years. So it significantly increases is oil and gas imports by something like 20% before the height of the conflict. So we are, the economy is quite well positioned from a stockpiling standpoint. The other point to note when it comes to China is that the energy mix still continues to rely quite heavily on domestic coal. So, unlike Japan and Korea, which rely heavily on gas, China is not really in the same league, if you like. The other thing, I think we mentioned this previously, as kind of a small note, is that China also has pretty massive overland pipeline connections to places like Russia, to Central Asia, and that kind of a pipeline diversification, means that it is relatively unaffected, not completely shielded, but relatively unaffected by the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. So I would say relative insulation, but obviously, in a world where demand destruction happens globally, China will probably feel some of that pain as well.
Ed, with the LNG prices soaring right now, is there enough gas to go around?
Well, those countries that contracted, who counted on these supplies, they're being very disappointed right now. There's not enough gas at the moment, and we've seen nations turn towards diesel, towards liquid petroleum, switching back to their coal, and they can probably do this for a short period of time. I will say that I think China is extremely well positioned to make the argument for energy security to all the nations across the globe and say, hey, come buy my solar panels. We've got them, they're less expensive, and you can put them out and we'll install them for you. This interruption has been long feared for decades by everyone across the globe. It's now happened. It shows how insecure the global energy supply chain is. And so I think we're going to see a faster shift to green, but only because if it's a solar panel, then you know it's on your soil, and you can access it anytime.
Colby, to what extent is this beginning to look like the energy shock we saw just after the start of the war in Ukraine?
Well, there's a key difference in the shock here, which is that it is an actual major disruption of supply. What took place in the aftermath of the beginning of the war in Ukraine was essentially a policy shift. Europe and a number of other major economies decided that they were going to shift away from purchases of Russian oil and gas. There was no actual supply disruption in the same way that there is now. That still, of course, puts forth the need to find alternatives. That aspect of it does not change. But the situation is exacerbated by the fact that the supply is simply not available. It's not something you've just chosen to shift away from again as the result of a change in policy.
Louise, if things don't improve and improve quickly, how vulnerable are Asian economies to recession? And which ones are the most vulnerable?
Yeah, I think if this situation, if this war-like situation continues, I would say for at least the next 2 or 3 months, we're likely to see some economies, especially the big net energy importers, likely go into, a little bit of either a mild recession or at least an outright contraction, in Q2. So we're looking at economies like Thailand, Philippines. Those are the economies that are most vulnerable. Japan as well. Coming out in our modeling as an economy that would stand to lose. I would say that one of the things that governments in the region, or at least central banks in the region, are closely monitoring is also the fact that currencies are depreciating in a few areas against a relatively strong dollar, and to the extent that that creates some of these tighter financing conditions for businesses, for consumers, that's not going to be a positive. And so that adds to the recessionary risk that we might be seeing, at least in the coming quarters.
Ed, how much damage is this causing for American consumers? Is it hitting them in the pocket? I know that gas or petrol prices, we're talking here, have risen. Why is that?
Well, it's a global market, and the refiner down on the Gulf Coast can sell his gasoline or diesel to anyone. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, Exxon chartered tankers to take gasoline to Asia. So the U.S. is in tremendous position in terms of its net imports and exports of petroleum. It actually will be beneficial for GDP. But that will come at the consumer's expense. Gasoline prices are up $1.50, $1.75 a gallon already across the United States. California, which is a net importing state, has prices reaching $8 a gallon. And the rule in Washington is the incumbent is not reelected if the price goes up at the pump or at the electricity meter. And the higher price of LNG is actually having an impact in the New England states. The New England states don't have enough pipelines to the producing regions for natural gas in the U.S. That's going to drive up their cost of heating, processing, and in particular electricity as we hit the summer season. it is going to have an impact, but it won't be recessionary for the United States.
Colby, what about Gulf nations? Right back at the beginning of the program, I read that quote from Qatar's energy minister. This will bring down the economies of the world. What about the economies of the Gulf? What's the worst case scenario they're looking at?
Well, for the Gulf states that are totally dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for their exports, they will feel it more so than others. So that would be, for instance, Qatar, of course, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq to a certain extent. They are projected to see much steeper economic contractions this year than those of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And a major reason for that is because both Saudi Arabia and the UAE do have alternate export routes because of pipelines that they built to essentially for this situation. So Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline that allows it to continue exporting oil through the Red Sea. It also has several major refineries on the Red Sea coast, so it can continue to export refined products. And the UAE has a similar situation as a result of the ADCOP pipeline, which sends crude to Fujairah, which is an extremely important export terminal that is, of course, out on the Indian Ocean and is outside of the Strait. That is something that is a lifeline in this scenario because although they are not able to export at full capacity, when you see prices this high, the ability to get really any amount of barrels out is certainly something that's helpful. However, the Gulf states are heavily dependent on oil and gas. Those are not their only major sectors in the economy. Aluminum is huge in the Gulf. That's taking a hit as well. And there are a number of other industries that of course are taking a hit from this. So most of the Gulf will probably see some form of a contraction, but because of those alternate export routes and alternate levels varying levels of economic diversification, it's not going to be something that's totally evenly distributed.
There, I'm afraid we must end it. Thank you very much indeed, Colby, Connolly, Louise Liu, and Ed Hers. And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything you heard in that discussion, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Try to use the hashtag AJCTC, please. Or you can drop us a line. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. And there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan. From the whole team, thanks for being with us. But stay tuned for our focus on Europe energy shock in this week's second edition of the show. Al Jazeera's continuing coverage of the war is next.